The room smelled faintly of lilies and antiseptic, fitting for a retirement party held in the hospital cafeteria. Streamers drooped from the ceiling tiles, and a slideshow of my younger years as a nurse flickered on a borrowed projector. Colleagues I hadn't seen in years clapped and laughed as I cut into a chocolate raspberry cake someone had remembered I loved. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to exhale. I hoped, this was the beginning of rest. That's when Thomas leaned in, his voice barely above the hum of the coffee machine. "No pay, no stay, Mom." My smile froze. My heart sank like a tray of dropped instruments. I'll never forget that evening. After 4 decades as head nurse at Memorial General, my colleagues had thrown me a beautiful retirement celebration. There were speeches, a video montage of my career, and even my favorite chocolate raspberry cake. For once, I felt valued, like maybe all those midnight shifts and missed holidays had been worth something. When I arrived home, still wearing the corsage my coworkers had pinned to my blouse, Thomas and his wife Vanessa were waiting in the living room, faces tight with what I initially mistook for concern. "Mom, we need to talk about arrangements going forward," Thomas said, not even asking about my party. I set down my purse, still smiling. "What arrangements, dear?" Vanessa cleared her throat. "Financial arrangements. With you retiring, there's the matter of household expenses." My smile faltered. "I've been paying half the mortgage and utilities for the past 15 years, plus watching the children for free. My pension will cover my share." Thomas exchanged glances with Vanessa. "Your pension won't be enough. We've calculated that without your full-time income, you'll be short about $1,200 a month for your fair share." "Fair share?" I repeated, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "I put the entire down payment on this house, $120,000 from selling your father's and my first home after he passed." Vanessa's perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against her phone. "That was 15 years ago, Caroline. You can't expect to coast on that forever." Thomas slid a paper across the coffee table. "We found a nice seniors apartment complex. It's subsidized, so you should be able to afford it on your pension." I stared at the brochure, remembering how I'd remortgaged my own home to help pay for Thomas's medical residency when student loans weren't enough. How I'd moved in with them originally to help when the twins were born prematurely, then stayed because they said they couldn't manage without me. "What about the children?" I asked quietly. "We'll hire someone," Thomas said dismissively. "Someone young who can keep up with them." That's when he said it, the words that changed everything. "Mom, I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. No pay, no stay." What my son didn't know was that my retirement package included something special, something that would change everything. I sat there, the retirement corsage suddenly feeling like it was choking me. The brochure for Golden Sunset Senior Living trembled in my hands, a bland beige building with tiny windows and artificial plants in the lobby. This was what 42 years of dedication had earned me. Thomas stood up, checking his watch. "We can drive you over to see it tomorrow. They have an opening next week." "Next week?" My voice sounded distant even to myself. "You want me out of my home in a week?" Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Caroline, this was never meant to be permanent. We've been more than generous letting you stay all these years." Letting me stay? In the home I had helped purchase? Where I had raised their children while they built their careers? "I need time to think," I managed to say. Thomas nodded, already heading toward his home office. "That's fine, but we need an answer by Friday. The rental market is competitive." After they left the room, I sat motionless, remembering the day Dr. Eleanor Whitman, the hospital's former chief of surgery, had called me into her office 3 months ago. "Caroline," she'd said, "your retirement is coming up. After everything you've done for this hospital, especially during that malpractice crisis years ago when you could have testified against us but chose loyalty instead, the board wants to show our appreciation." She'd handed me an envelope containing a letter confirming a loyalty bonus of $1.8 million. I had nearly fainted right there in her leather chair. "We've kept this quiet," Dr. Whitman had explained. "Hospital finances are sensitive. And we don't want every retiring employee expecting the same. But you saved this institution, Caroline. We never forgot. I hadn't told Thomas or Vanessa. At first, I'd planned to surprise them by paying off their mortgage as a gift. Then I thought about funding college accounts for the grandchildren. But something had always held me back from mentioning it, some instinct I couldn't name. Now, as I looked at the senior living brochure with its promises of weekly bingo and monthly nurse visits, I understood what that instinct had been. I carefully placed the brochure on the coffee table, went upstairs to my room, and closed the door. From beneath my sweaters in the bottom drawer, I retrieved the bank statement showing my new account balance: $1,837,452.09. The next morning, while Thomas and Vanessa were at work and the children at school, I called James Frazier, my old friend from high school who had become a real estate attorney. When he answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "James," I said quietly, "I need to know if I can buy a house without the current owners knowing who the buyer is." His chuckle warmed me. "Caroline Winters, what are you up to?" "Something I should have done years ago," I replied. "Setting things right." James met me for coffee that afternoon at a small cafe far from my neighborhood. At 72, he still had the same mischievous eyes that had gotten him into trouble in high school, though his once black hair was now silver. "So let me understand this correctly," he said, leaning forward. "You want to purchase the house where you currently live? The house your son thinks he's evicting you from, without him knowing you're the buyer?" I nodded, stirring my tea. "It's not legally his house, James. It's owned by a property management company that Thomas and Vanessa have been making payments to. They've never actually owned it." James raised an eyebrow. "And you know this how?" "Because I set it up that way," I explained. After Robert died, I was worried about Thomas's spending habits. He was brilliant in medicine, but terrible with money. So when I sold our old house and used the money for the down payment on this one, I worked with a financial advisor to create Winters Family Holdings. Understanding dawned on James's face. "You're the property management company. I own 51%. Thomas owns the rest, but he's never paid attention to the paperwork, assuming it was just standard rental documentation. His name is on the rental agreement, but the deed is held by the LLC." James whistled softly. "Caroline Winters, you sly fox. Why not just tell them you own the house?" I gazed out the window. I wanted Thomas to feel responsible, to build good financial habits by making regular payments. I was going to transfer full ownership to him when he turned 50 as a surprise. That's next year. I turned back to James. But now I'm thinking of a different surprise. The plan was simple. Winters Family Holdings would serve Thomas and Vanessa with a notice that the property was being sold. They would have the option to purchase it outright or vacate. Given their lifestyle, the luxury cars, private schools, country club memberships, I knew they couldn't afford the lump sum needed to buy the house at current market value. "They'll have to leave," I said quietly. James frowned. "But Caroline, that means you'll have to leave too." I smiled for the first time that day. "Not necessarily." The next morning, Thomas cornered me in the kitchen while I was packing lunches for the grandchildren. "Mom, I need an answer about the senior living facility. They're holding the unit for you, but they need a deposit by tomorrow." I carefully sliced an apple, keeping my voice neutral. "I've decided not to move just yet." His face hardened. "We've been through this. We can't afford to support you anymore." "I don't need your support, Thomas. I never have." Before he could respond, his phone rang. James Frazier's office number flashing on the screen. Thomas frowned at the unknown caller, but answered. "Dr. Winters speaking." His expression shifted from confusion to shock as he listened. "What do you mean being sold? That's impossible. We have a rental agreement. Who's buying it?" "I understand. Yes, I'll hold for the email." He looked at me, face pale. "The house is being sold." I nodded, continuing to pack the children's lunches. "Yes, I heard. The letter came yesterday while you were at work." "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. I sealed the lunch boxes and smiled. "I thought it might interfere with your plans to move me into Golden Sunset." The next 48 hours in that house were electric with tension. Thomas and Vanessa huddled in whispered conversations, made frantic phone calls, and glared at me as if I were somehow responsible for their predicament. I continued my daily routine, preparing meals, helping the grandchildren with homework, tending to my small garden of herbs and tomatoes in the backyard. On Thursday evening, Thomas stormed into the kitchen where I was teaching 11-year-old Emma how to make her great-grandmother's lasagna recipe. "The bank won't approve an emergency loan large enough to buy the house," he announced, his voice tight with frustration. "We have to be out in 30 days. Emma looked up from where she was carefully layering noodles. "We're moving? But what about Grandma?" Thomas barely glanced at his daughter. "Grandma will be moving to a retirement home like we discussed." "I haven't agreed to that," I said calmly, sprinkling cheese. Thomas slammed his hand on the counter, making Emma jump. "This isn't a negotiation anymore. We're all losing our home. You need to be practical." "Watch your tone," I said evenly. "You're frightening your daughter." He took a deep breath, visibly struggling for control. "The house is being sold to some investment company, Platinum Bay Properties, probably going to flip it or turn it into rentals." I nodded sympathetically. "That sounds challenging. What's your plan?" "Our plan?" He laughed bitterly. "Our plan is ruined. We'll have to downsize to an apartment until we figure something out. The market is insane right now." Vanessa appeared in the doorway, her eyes red. "The realtor called. They're bringing the new owner by tomorrow to inspect the property." She looked at me accusingly. "You'll need to make sure your room is presentable." "Of course," I agreed pleasantly. "First impressions matter." That night, I packed a small overnight bag and called a taxi for early the next morning. I left before anyone else was awake, leaving a note that I was spending the day with an old colleague. James picked me up 2 blocks away. "Ready for this?" he asked as I settled into the passenger seat. "More than ready," I replied. We drove to his office where I signed the final paperwork for Platinum Bay Properties, the company I had established 3 days earlier with James's help. By 10 a.m., I was officially the new owner of the house I had helped purchase 15 years ago. At precisely 2 p.m., James pulled into the driveway with me in the back seat. Thomas and Vanessa were waiting in the front yard, wearing the forced smiles they typically reserved for hospital fundraisers. "Remember," James murmured as he opened my door, "let me do the talking at first." I stepped out, wearing a dress and pearls I'd never worn at home, my hair freshly styled at the salon where we'd stopped after the signing. Thomas stared at me in confusion. "Mom, what are you doing here? We thought you were with friends." Vanessa looked between James and me, understanding dawning on her face. "You're the buyer's agent," she said to James. "But who's the buyer?" James smiled professionally. "Allow me to introduce you to the owner of Platinum Bay Properties," he said, gesturing toward me. Thomas's face went blank with shock. "What?" I straightened my shoulders and met my son's eyes directly. "Hello, Thomas. I'm here to see my new house." The silence that followed my announcement stretched uncomfortably in the warm afternoon air. Thomas's face cycled through emotions: shock, confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. "This is some kind of joke," he said flatly. James handed him a folder. "Here are the official ownership documents and the new terms for occupancy of the property. As you can see, everything is legally binding." Vanessa snatched the folder, flipping through documents with trembling hands. "How is this possible? You're a retired nurse. You don't have this kind of money." I walked past them toward the front door. "Shall we continue this conversation inside?" The neighbors are starting to notice. Sure enough, Mrs. Delaney across the street had paused her gardening to watch us with undisguised interest. In the living room, Thomas rounded on me. "Explain yourself, now." "It's quite simple," I replied. "The hospital awarded me a substantial retirement bonus for my years of service, and for a specific situation I helped them navigate years ago. I used part of that money to purchase this house through my company, Platinum Bay Properties." "Your company?" Thomas laughed incredulously. "Since when do you own a company?" Since about the same time you decided I was a financial burden rather than your mother, I answered calmly. Vanessa collapsed onto the sofa. This is insane. You can't just buy our house out from under us. Actually, I can. And I did. I turned to face them both. The house was never yours to begin with. Winters Family Holdings has owned it all along, and I control the majority stake in that company. Thomas went pale. What are you talking about? When your father died and I used our savings for the down payment, I set up the holding company as a precaution. You've been making payments to my company for 15 years, building equity that I plan to gift to you next year on your 50th birthday. Thomas sank onto the couch beside Vanessa. So, all this time, I was trying to teach you financial responsibility while protecting this asset for our family, I finished for him. But then you decided I was disposable once I retired. That's not fair, Vanessa protested weakly. We were just being practical about finances. No, you were being cruel, I corrected her. And now I'm being practical. James cleared his throat. As the new official owner, Mrs. Winters is prepared to offer you a lease agreement. He handed them another document. The monthly rent would be comparable to what you've been paying to Winters Family Holdings, with a few adjustments. Thomas scanned the document, his face darkening. This says we have to provide you with the master bedroom and private bathroom, meals and transportation when needed. This isn't a lease. It's making us your caretakers, I smiled. Oh, I'm not moving back in. Those provisions are for the actual tenant. What tenant? Vanessa asked suspiciously. I checked my watch. She should be arriving shortly. A lovely woman named Delia Rodriguez. She's a retired elementary school teacher with limited mobility. The rent I'm charging her is well below market rate, and the care provisions are part of the arrangement. Thomas jumped to his feet. You're replacing us with a stranger? Not replacing you, I clarified. You're welcome to stay, as tenants alongside Delia, providing the services outlined in the lease. Or you can choose to move out. Either way, Golden Sunset won't be necessary for me. I've purchased a lovely condo near the lake. The doorbell rang, and James went to answer it. Thomas stared at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You've been planning this all along, haven't you? I shook my head. No, Thomas. You planned this the moment you decided your mother wasn't worth keeping around. James returned to the living room accompanied by a woman in her late 60s using a walker. She had warm brown eyes, silver-streaked black hair pulled into a neat bun, and a gentle smile that immediately lit up the room. Everyone, this is Delia Rodriguez, I said, moving to help her to the most comfortable chair. Delia, this is my son Thomas and his wife Vanessa. It's wonderful to meet Caroline's family, Delia said warmly. She's told me so much about you. Thomas and Vanessa muttered stiff greetings, clearly still processing what was happening. Delia and I met years ago at the hospital, I explained. Her late husband was one of my patients. She's been living in an apartment building that's being converted to condominiums, and she needs to relocate quickly. So you're just giving her our house? Thomas demanded. I'm renting her a room in my house, I corrected, and offering you the opportunity to stay on as fellow tenants under the conditions outlined in that lease. Vanessa's face was a storm cloud. This is ridiculous. You can't expect us to be caretakers for a complete stranger. Delia's smile dimmed slightly. I don't require caretakers, just some basic accommodations and occasional assistance. I'm quite independent. That's not the point, Thomas exploded. This is our home. It was never your home, legally speaking, James interjected quietly. And now the choice is simple. Accept the new lease terms or find alternative housing within 30 days. Thomas turned to me, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do you have any idea what you're doing to your grandchildren? Turning their lives upside down like this? A flash of genuine pain shot through me at the mention of Emma, Zach, and little Lily. I adored those children, had practically raised them while Thomas and Vanessa built their careers. The children are welcome to stay with me at my new condo anytime they wish, I said. In fact, I've purchased a property with an extra bedroom specifically for them to visit. You think they'll want to visit after this stunt? Vanessa hissed. I met her gaze steadily. I think they deserve to know the truth about why their grandmother suddenly disappeared from their lives, which is what you were planning, wasn't it? Grandma had to move to a special place for old people. Isn't that what you were going to tell them? The guilty flush on her face told me I'd hit the mark. Delia cleared her throat gently. Perhaps I should come back another time. No need, Thomas said coldly. We won't be staying under these conditions. You can have the house. He grabbed Vanessa's arm. Let's go. Where? Vanessa protested. We can't just leave. We'll get a hotel, call a real estate agent, find something else. Thomas was already pulling her toward the door. I won't stay another minute in this house. James stepped forward. Doctor. Winters, I should remind you that your personal belongings remain in the home. We'll need to arrange a time for you to collect them. Thomas paused at the door, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. You'll be hearing from our attorney. After they stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, a heavy silence fell over the living room. Delia looked at me with concern. Caroline, are you sure about this? I don't want to come between you and your family. I sat down across from her, suddenly exhausted. You aren't coming between us, Delia. Thomas did that the moment he decided I was a burden instead of his mother. James squeezed my shoulder. I should follow them, make sure they don't do anything rash. Will you be all right? I nodded, watching him leave through the front window. As his car pulled away, I turned to Delia with a tired smile. Well, that went about as expected. Would you like some tea? She reached over and patted my hand. I think we both could use something stronger, dear. The children came home from school to find Delia and me sharing a pot of tea in the kitchen. Emma was the first to notice something was wrong. Grandma, where's Mom and Dad? And who's this? She asked, eyeing Delia curiously. I introduced Delia as an old friend who would be staying with us for a while. Before I could explain further, Thomas and Vanessa returned with Vanessa's parents in tow. Marilyn and Howard Buchanan had never approved of me. Children, go to your rooms, Thomas ordered as they burst through the door. But Dad, Zach protested. Now! Thomas rarely raised his voice to the children, and all three scurried upstairs, throwing concerned glances over their shoulders. Howard stepped forward, puffing up his chest importantly. As a bank executive, he was used to intimidating people with his presence alone. Caroline, what is the meaning of this? He demanded. Thomas tells us you've somehow manipulated property records to steal their house. I'd be careful about making accusations of fraud, I replied evenly. Everything I've done is completely legal. I owned the house all along. That's absurd, Marilyn scoffed. Thomas has been making mortgage payments for 15 years. Rent payments, I corrected, to a company I control. The arrangement was always meant to help Thomas learn financial responsibility while protecting the asset. Howard's face reddened. Whatever scheme you've cooked up, it won't stand. I've already called our family attorney. Please, invite him over, I said calmly. I'm sure James would enjoy explaining the legal documents to a colleague. Marilyn turned to Delia, who had been silently observing the confrontation. And who exactly are you supposed to be? Delia straightened in her chair. I'm the new tenant, Mrs. Buchanan. Carolyn has graciously offered me accommodations at a reasonable rate. Tenant? Marilyn practically spat the word. This is my son's house. Actually, came a small voice from the doorway. It's Grandma's house. I heard everything. We all turned to see Emma standing there, clutching her tablet. Behind her were Zach and Lily, their faces solemn. You're supposed to be in your room, Thomas said weakly. Emma held up her tablet. I was on a video call with Lily's teacher when you came in. We heard everything through the speaker. Her voice trembled slightly. You tried to send Grandma away to some old people's home because she retired? Thomas and Vanessa exchanged panicked looks. It's not like that, sweetie, Vanessa began. We were just trying to make arrangements that would work for everyone. By throwing Grandma out? Zach asked incredulously. The same Grandma who takes care of us every day? Lily, only 6 years old, pushed past her siblings and ran to me, climbing into my lap and wrapping her arms around my neck. "I don't want you to go away, Grandma." Howard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Children, this is a complicated adult situation. You don't understand." "We understand perfectly," Emma interrupted, showing a maturity beyond her 11 years. "Dad and Mom didn't want Grandma anymore because she stopped making money. That's horrible." Marilyn glared at me. "See what you've done? Turning the children against their parents." "I haven't said a word to them," I pointed out, holding Lily close. "They heard the truth directly from you." Thomas looked stricken, finally seeming to realize how his actions appeared through his children's eyes. He knelt down, trying to meet Emma's gaze, but she turned away from him. "Grandma," she said, ignoring her father, "if you have your own house now, can we come live with you instead?" A shocked silence fell over the room. Vanessa's face crumpled and she sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "Oh, sweetheart," I said gently, "that's not how this works. Your parents love you very much. This disagreement is between us adults." But the damage was done. In trying to discard me, Thomas and Vanessa had inadvertently revealed a side of themselves their children had never seen before, and the children were old enough to recognize callousness when they saw it. Howard cleared his throat again. "Perhaps we should all take some time to cool down and discuss this rationally later." I nodded in agreement. "That seems wise. In the meantime, I'll be moving my things to my new condo tomorrow. Delia will be taking the guest room downstairs." The finality in my voice seemed to hit Thomas harder than all the shouting had. For the first time, he looked truly lost. "Mom," he said quietly, "what have we done?" The following week passed in a blur of activity. I moved into my new lakeside condo, a beautiful 2-bedroom unit with a balcony overlooking the water. It was the first home I'd chosen entirely for myself in over 4 decades, and despite the family drama, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Thomas made several attempts to contact me, leaving voicemails that evolved from angry demands to speak with my lawyer, to awkward apologies, to finally a defeated request just to talk. I wasn't ready. The wound was still too fresh, the betrayal too raw. Vanessa's parents had apparently hired an attorney who, after reviewing all the documentation, reluctantly informed them that my ownership was legally ironclad. Howard left a particularly nasty message suggesting I'd planned this con for years, which I promptly deleted. On Saturday morning, as I was arranging photos on my new bookshelf, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Emma, Zach, and Lily standing there with overnight bags, accompanied by a clearly uncomfortable Vanessa. "The children wanted to see your new place," she said stiffly. We thought it might be good for them to spend the weekend with you, if that's convenient." The grandchildren pushed past their mother and surrounded me with hugs before racing off to explore the condo. "It has a pool, Grandma," Zach called excitedly from the balcony. Vanessa lingered in the doorway, looking lost. I gestured for her to come in, but she shook her head. "I should get back. Thomas is packing. We found a rental house across town. It's smaller than what we're used to, but it will do until we figure things out." "I see," I said neutrally. She fidgeted with her purse strap. "The children are very upset with us. They think we're monsters for trying to send you away." "Children have a simple sense of justice," I replied. "Is that why you're doing this? Justice?" There was a bitter edge to her voice. I considered her question carefully. "No, not justice. Self-preservation. You and Thomas made it clear I was disposable once I stopped being useful. I'm simply ensuring I have control over my own future." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. You never meant for me to have options," I finished for her. "That was your mistake." Vanessa stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "I'll pick them up Sunday evening." After she left, I spent a wonderful weekend with my grandchildren. We swam in the community pool, baked cookies in my new kitchen, and watched movies on the sofa. Not once did they ask about the situation with their parents, but I could tell they were processing it in their own ways. On Sunday afternoon, As we sat on the balcony eating ice cream and watching boats on the lake, Emma asked the question I'd been expecting. "Grandma, are you and Dad ever going to be okay again?" I put my arm around her shoulders. "I hope so, sweetheart. We just need time." "Dad cries at night," Lily volunteered, chocolate ice cream smeared across her chin. "I heard him. He thinks you hate him." My heart constricted. Despite everything, Thomas was still my son. "I don't hate your father, Lily. I'm just very disappointed and hurt." Zach, always the pragmatist, looked up from his sundae. "But you're not coming back to live with us, are you?" "No," I said gently. "This is my home now, but you three can visit anytime you want." "It's not the same," Emma said sadly. "Everything's wrong now." I had no answer for that. Everything was wrong, and I wasn't entirely blameless. In my determination to stand up for myself, I had disrupted the children's lives too. The righteousness I'd felt when confronting Thomas and Vanessa now mingled with a complicated guilt. When Vanessa arrived to collect the children, her eyes were red-rimmed. She thanked me stiffly for having them, and we exchanged awkward pleasantries about school schedules and Lily's upcoming dance recital. As they were leaving, Vanessa paused. "Thomas wanted me to ask, would you consider meeting with him this week, just to talk?" I hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Tell him to call me. We'll arrange something." After they left, I stood alone in my beautiful new condo, surrounded by carefully chosen furniture and perfect lakeside views, and wondered why victory felt so hollow. Thomas suggested meeting at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He'd ordered mine exactly how I liked it. Medium roast with a splash of cream, no sugar. It was a small gesture that reminded me of better days. He stood awkwardly when he saw me. "Mom, thank you for coming." I sat down across from him, noticing the dark circles under his eyes and the rumpled condition of his normally immaculate clothes. Thomas had always been meticulous about his appearance, a trait he'd inherited from his father. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a few minutes, both sipping our coffee and avoiding each other's eyes. "How's Delia settling in?" he finally asked. "Very well. She's enjoying the garden." I paused. "How's the rental house?" Thomas grimaced. "It's fine. Smaller than we're used to. The children are sharing a room, which hasn't been easy." He set down his cup. "Mom, I need to explain about that night, about what happened after your retirement party." "I'm listening," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He ran a hand through his hair. "Vanessa and I have been struggling financially for a while now. We never told you because I was embarrassed. A successful doctor shouldn't have money problems." This surprised me. "What kind of problems?" Thomas stared into his coffee. "We've been living beyond our means for years. The country club memberships, private schools, luxury cars, all of it to keep up appearances with Vanessa's family and my colleagues. We're drowning in credit card debt. When you retired, we genuinely panicked about losing your contribution to the household expenses. So your solution was to throw me away?" The words came out sharper than I intended. He flinched. "It sounds horrible when you put it that way." "How else should I put it, Thomas?" "We thought—" He hesitated, then continued in a rush of words. "We thought you'd be better off in assisted living, that it would be more appropriate for your needs as you aged. We convinced ourselves we were doing what was best for everyone." I took a careful sip of coffee to hide my trembling hands. "Did you ever once consider asking me what I wanted? What I needed?" Thomas looked away. And that's unforgivable." "It is," I agreed quietly. He reached across the table, not quite touching my hand. "But I'm asking you to forgive me anyway, not for my sake, but for the children. They're devastated by all this, and they miss you terribly at home." "They're perceptive," I said. "They recognize the injustice immediately." "Kids have a simple view of right and wrong," Thomas sighed. "Sometimes simple is correct," I countered. "What you and Vanessa did was wrong, Thomas. You treated me like an expendable asset rather than your mother." He nodded miserably. "I know, and you had every right to protect yourself. But I need you to know something I should have told you years ago. I waited, watching him struggle with whatever revelation was coming. Do you remember when I was in my 3rd year of medical school and almost dropped out? He asked. I nodded. Of course I remembered. It had been a terrible time. Thomas suddenly talking about quitting, throwing away years of hard work and sacrifice. I'd never fully understood what triggered that crisis. I was failing pharmacology, he continued. Not just struggling, completely failing. My professor told me I had no future in medicine. His voice caught. I was going to quit rather than tell you I'd failed. After everything you'd sacrificed for my education, I couldn't bear to disappoint you. I never knew, I whispered. Because Dad fixed it, Thomas said. Before he died, he went to the dean and made a substantial donation to the research program. Enough to get me a second chance with a different professor. He made me promise never to tell you because he knew you'd be upset about using money to solve the problem. I sat back, stunned. Robert had never mentioned this, even in our most private moments. Dad told me something I never forgot, Thomas continued. He said, your mother would give up everything she has for you. Your job is to make sure she never has to. I failed him, Mom. I failed both of you. Tears welled in his eyes. When you told us you were retiring, all I could think about was the financial impact. I forgot you were my mother. I became exactly what Vanessa's parents wanted, someone who measures people's worth by their bank accounts. I sat in silence, absorbing this unexpected revelation about Robert, about Thomas, about the past we'd shared and the mistakes we'd made. It didn't excuse what Thomas had done, but it cast a different light on the man he'd become. I've spent my whole life trying to prove I deserve the second chance Dad bought me, Thomas said quietly. I became obsessed with success, with appearances, with never looking like a failure, and in the process, I failed at the one thing that really mattered, being a good son. I left the coffee shop with my mind swimming. Thomas's revelation about his near failure in medical school and Robert's intervention had caught me completely off guard. All these years, I'd believed Thomas had sailed through his education on his own merits, that my sacrifices had directly enabled his success. Learning that Robert had orchestrated a second chance through a donation changed something fundamental in my understanding of our family history. As I drove home along the lakefront, memories of Robert flooded back. He died during Thomas's final year of medical school, a sudden heart attack that left no time for goodbyes. We'd had our problems, but he'd loved Thomas fiercely, perhaps more fiercely than I'd understood. When I arrived home, I found Delia waiting with fresh-baked banana bread and concern in her eyes. How did it go? She asked, pouring me a cup of tea. I sank into a chair at my kitchen table. Complicated. Thomas revealed something about my late husband, something I never knew. Delia nodded wisely. Families are like icebergs. Most of what matters is hidden beneath the surface. It doesn't excuse what he did, I said firmly. Of course not. Delia pushed a slice of banana bread toward me. But understanding someone's failings is different from excusing them. I picked at the bread, not really hungry. Thomas and Vanessa are struggling financially. They've been living far beyond their means for years, trying to maintain appearances. Pride, Delia sighed. It ruins more families than poverty ever could. He wants me to forgive him. And will you? I stared out at the lake, watching sunlight dance across the water. I don't know. Part of me wants to. He's still my son, and I love him. But another part feels that forgiveness is too easy, that it erases the harm he was willing to do. Delia was quiet for a moment. My Alberto was a proud man too. When his business failed, he couldn't bring himself to tell me. He kept borrowing money, getting deeper into debt, all to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. By the time I discovered the truth, we were nearly bankrupt. What did you do? I asked. I was furious, she admitted. I felt betrayed, lied to. I almost left him. She smiled sadly. But then I realized something important. His pride wasn't about him. It was about me, about not wanting me to worry, not wanting to fail me. That's different, I protested. Thomas wasn't trying to protect me. He was trying to get rid of me. Delia shook her head. I'm not saying the situations are identical, just that pride makes people do terrible things, especially to those they love most. The question is, what happens now? That evening, I found myself opening boxes I hadn't touched since the move, boxes containing family photos and mementos. In one, I discovered a journal Robert had kept during Thomas's medical school years. I'd never read it. It had seemed too private somehow. With trembling fingers, I opened it to a random page dated during Thomas's 3rd year. Robert's familiar handwriting filled the page. Met with Dean Foster today. Donation arranged. Thomas will get his second chance with Dr. Brenner teaching the remedial course. Caroline must never know. It would break her heart to think money solved this problem. She believes so strongly in earning your way. But what's the point of having resources if not to help your child? Thomas is devastated by his failure. Reminds me of myself at that age, terrified of disappointing people. Must help him see that failure isn't final. It's just feedback. Hardest part will be making him promise never to tell Caroline. She sacrifices everything for him. She doesn't need to sacrifice her principles, too. Tears blurred my vision as I read. This was a side of Robert I'd never fully known. A man who understood both my values and when to circumvent them for our son's sake. A man who had kept secrets not to deceive me, but to protect both Thomas and me in different ways. I turned to more recent entries, written just weeks before Robert's death. Thomas is thriving now. His confidence has returned. Sometimes I worry we made a mistake, that he needed to face that failure head-on. But watching him with patience, seeing his compassion and skill, I know we did right. Caroline is so proud of him. Her pride is a fierce, beautiful thing, but it has its cost. She would work herself to death for his future. My job has always been to make sure that doesn't happen. If anything happens to me, I hope Thomas remembers that. The journal slipped from my hands onto the floor. Robert had seen it all so clearly. My strengths, my weaknesses, the dynamics between Thomas and me. And he'd tried in his way to balance things. Thomas hadn't remembered. He'd forgotten his father's most important lesson. But the question remained, was this understanding enough to rebuild what had been broken between us? The following weekend, I invited Thomas and his family over to my condo for dinner. It was time to clear the air, to decide what our relationship would look like moving forward. If not forgiveness, then at least understanding. I prepared Robert's favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary potatoes and green beans, just as I'd made every Sunday when Thomas was growing up. The familiar smells filled my new kitchen, creating a bridge between past and present. They arrived punctually at 6, the children rushing in with enthusiastic hugs while Thomas and Vanessa lingered awkwardly by the door, bearing flowers and wine they weren't sure I'd accept. "Come in," I said, taking their offerings. "Everything's almost ready." Throughout dinner, conversation remained polite but strained among the adults, while the children chattered happily about school and friends. After dessert, apple pie, another family tradition, I suggested the children watch a movie in the second bedroom where I'd set up a small entertainment area specifically for their visits. Once they were settled, I brought Robert's journal to the dining table and placed it between us. "I found this last week," I said quietly. "It's your father's journal from your medical school years." Thomas stared at it, recognition dawning on his face. "I remember him writing in this. I never knew what it contained. Neither did I until now." I opened to the pages I'd marked. "Read this." Thomas pulled the journal closer, Vanessa leaning in beside him. As they read, I watched emotions play across their faces, surprise, then understanding, then something deeper. Thomas looked up with tears in his eyes. "He never told me he kept a journal," he whispered. "All these thoughts about me, about you." "About all of us," I corrected gently. "About family and pride and the things we do for love." Vanessa wiped a tear from her cheek. "Caroline, I don't know what to say. We were so wrong." I nodded in acknowledgement of her apology, but kept my focus on Thomas. Your father understood something important about you, about your fear of failure, about your pride. He protected you from a consequence that might have derailed your life, but he never intended for that protection to extend to treating others callously. Thomas closed the journal carefully. I've spent my whole adult life terrified of failing, of not measuring up to what Dad and you sacrificed for me. When we started struggling financially, I couldn't admit it. It felt like proving I was the failure my pharmacology professor said I was. So instead of asking for help, you decided to cut expenses, I said. And I was an expense. He flinched at the bluntness of my words. Yes, it's inexcusable. It is, I agreed. But I understand it better now. Vanessa reached for my hand across the table, her usual polish giving way to genuine emotion. My parents always made Thomas feel he wasn't good enough, that he needed to maintain a certain lifestyle to be worthy of their daughter. I encouraged that instead of standing up to them. I'm deeply sorry. I let her hold my hand for a moment before gently withdrawing it. The past few weeks have given me clarity about many things. I've spent my entire adult life defining myself by what I gave to others, to Robert, to Thomas, to you, to the grandchildren. When you decided I was no longer worth keeping around, it forced me to consider my own value, separate from what I contribute to this family. Thomas looked stricken. Mom, that's not... Let me finish, I said firmly. I'm not willing to return to the previous arrangement. I won't live in that house again, not even as the official owner. I found something better, independence. We understand, Vanessa said quickly. We've signed a 6-month lease on the rental. It's actually been good for us to simplify. I nodded. As for Delia, she's decided to stay in the house. She's offered to rent rooms to nursing students from Memorial General at reasonable rates, creating a kind of cooperative living arrangement. I think it's a wonderful idea. So the house will become, Thomas trailed off. A home for people who need one, I replied. Just as it was for me, for us, for years. The rental income will be modest but sufficient to maintain the property, and anything beyond that will go into trust funds for the grandchildren's education. Thomas stared at me in wonder. You've thought of everything. I've had time to think, I said. About what matters, about forgiveness, about family. Vanessa cleared her throat nervously. And what conclusions have you reached? About forgiveness, I mean. I looked between them, these two people who had been willing to discard me when I became inconvenient. Then I thought of Robert, of his secrets kept for love, of the grandchildren in the next room who deserved a family not fractured by bitterness. Forgiveness isn't an event, I said carefully. It's a process. I'm willing to begin that process, but trust will take longer to rebuild. Thomas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. That's more than we deserve. It is, I agreed. But family isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to love anyway. I stood up, signaling an end to this part of our conversation. Now, shall we join the children for some of the movie? As we moved toward the bedroom where the children were watching their film, I felt a weight lift, not completely, but enough to stand straighter, to breathe more easily. This new chapter wasn't what I'd planned, but perhaps it was what I needed all along. By the way, I added casually as Thomas passed me, I'd be happy to look over your finances sometime. Before I was a nurse, I worked in accounting. You might be surprised what we can salvage. For the first time in weeks, Thomas smiled at me. A genuine smile that reached his eyes and reminded me, just for a moment, of the boy he had once been. I'd like that, Mom. I'd like that very much. 6 months later, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. So much had changed since that fateful retirement party night when Thomas had uttered those cutting words. No pay, no stay. The house that had once been our family home was now thriving as a cooperative living space. Delia oversaw 4 nursing students who rented rooms at affordable rates, creating a vibrant, multi-generational household filled with energy and purpose. I visited often, helping with Sunday dinners and offering career advice to the young nurses who reminded me so much of myself decades ago. Thomas and Vanessa had completed their 6-month lease and made a surprising decision. They weren't looking for a larger house. Instead, They renovated the rental property they'd initially considered temporary, simplifying their lives in ways they'd never imagined possible. "We don't need 5 bedrooms and 3 living areas," Thomas had explained during one of our weekly financial counseling sessions. "The kids are happier with less stuff and more time together." Those counseling sessions had been transformative. I'd helped Thomas and Vanessa create a realistic budget, negotiate with creditors, and slowly climb out of the financial hole they'd dug. There had been difficult conversations and painful sacrifices. The country club membership, private schools, luxury vehicles all went. But with each simplified choice came a visible lightening in Thomas's demeanor. Vanessa had surprised me most of all. Without her parents' constant pressure about maintaining appearances, she discovered talents and interests she'd suppressed for years. She started a small bookkeeping business from home, using skills from her previous career in finance that she'd abandoned when the children were born. "I never thought I'd thank you for turning our lives upside down," she'd confessed during a recent visit. "But it was the wake-up call we needed." My relationships with the grandchildren had deepened rather than diminished. They spent alternate weekends with me at the condo, and I attended every school performance, sports game, and recital with renewed appreciation for these moments that had once seemed routine. The grandchildren had adapted to the new normal with the resilience only young people possess. Emma had even written an essay for school titled "How My Grandmother Taught Me About Standing Up for Yourself" that had won a district-wide competition. As for my own life, it had blossomed in unexpected ways. I joined a community choir, took watercolor classes at the senior center, and even started dating Arthur, a retired cardiologist I'd met during a lakeside walking group. At 72, I was discovering parts of myself that had been submerged beneath decades of caregiving and sacrifice. The retirement bonus from the hospital remained largely intact. Beyond the house purchase and setting up my new home, I'd been careful with the funds, investing most of it with an eye toward my long-term security and eventual inheritance for the grandchildren. My phone chimed with a text message from Thomas. "Kids packed for weekend. Emma has a science project she wants your help with. Still okay for pickup at 10? I smiled and texted back. "Looking forward to it. Bring swimsuits. Forecast is perfect for the pool." Setting down the phone, I reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The night of my retirement party had been a breaking point, a moment when decades of accumulated resentments and unspoken expectations had collided in a perfect storm of hurt and betrayal. "No pay, no stay" had been the catalyst that forced all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our relationships. I wouldn't say I was grateful for that painful moment. The wound had cut too deep for such simple gratitude. But I could acknowledge that sometimes it takes a complete rupture to rebuild something stronger and more authentic from the broken pieces. The house I had purchased in a moment of righteous anger had served its purpose, not as a weapon of revenge, but as a reminder that we all have choices about how we allow ourselves to be treated. It had become a symbol not of division, but of transformation. I no longer defined my worth by what I could give to others. Thomas no longer measured his success by external appearances. Vanessa no longer lived in fear of disappointing her parents. And the grandchildren had witnessed a powerful lesson about standing up for oneself without destroying what matters most. As the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear over the lake, I raised my teacup in a silent toast to Robert, wherever he might be. "You were right," I whispered to the evening breeze. It was never about the house. It was always about knowing our own worth. The night of my retirement party had ended one chapter of my life and begun another. One I never could have imagined, but now wouldn't trade for anything. Sometimes the most painful endings lead to the most beautiful beginnings. And sometimes buying a house isn't about property at all. It's about reclaiming your place in the world and the dignity that should have been yours all along.